Our next speaker is Carlos Fernández Valdovinos, Governor and President of the Central Bank of Paraguay. In addition to holding several positions at the bank prior to his appointment as president last October, Mr. Valdovinos has also served as a senior economist at both the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Along the way, he has maintained a robust academic career with faculty appointments at the National University of Edición, Georgetown University, and the University of Chicago, among several others. I'm sure all benefit from his analysis through the prism of a broad international experience. Please welcome Governor Valdovinos.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate at this seminar, this conference. I'm gonna avoid talking about the nice city, the beautiful beach, the good food, the perfect weather outside, because I risk that you all will leave the room and not going to listen to me. So let me start right now with some economics. And let me focus on Latin America, basically, because this is, I believe, my expertise. And I'm going to complement what Julio was saying before. This is briefly what I'm going to talk about. It is brief about what is the new international context, what have been doing the different countries in Latin America. And of course, coming all the way from Paraguay, let me spend at least 3 minutes to do some marketing about my country also, and how we're preparing for the new global economy. And finally, I'm gonna do some summary and some policy discussion about what countries should be doing in the near term. We are now almost 6 years after the beginning of the largest economic crisis in the last 80 years. And the global economy is still recovering, it's in transition, but at least we can see some green shoots. We see some recovery. You can see here the latest IMF projections, and across all the regions you can see a recovery, meaning that in 2014, it's going to be a better year than in 2013. Especially, this is true in the US. The governor of Florida was talking about that, about Florida, but it's also true in the whole US. And albeit at a more slowly pace, is true also for Europe, that for the first time is going out of the recession and now finally is going to have a positive growth rate. Now, this new normal in the global economy poses some positive risk and some negative risks. On the one side, and let me talk about Latin America, the recovery of the US economy will represent a push for the Latin American economies. It's going to be a positive factor. But on the negative side, what we can see is a fast recovery in the US could mean that the monetary tightening will go faster. The monetary tightening going faster could create a lot of volatility in emerging markets, meaning a lot of uncertainty, some capital outflows. I'm going to talk about that later on. So the recovery is underway, but you can see some challenges still facing emerging markets. And let me talk about some of them that I consider are very important. The first one you can see there is the deceleration in China. China seems to be moving all the way around. Instead of having a better growth projection, at this moment it's having lower growth projections. That is going to be important for some Latin American economies, especially those who are exporting a lot of goods to China. Of course, the deceleration in China is going to imply also a lowering of commodity prices, and you all know that in Latin America we are a big exporter of commodities. Of course, we are like kind of two different type of commodity exporter. One that is selling mainly minerals, mining, and those selling basically food. We believe that those selling minerals are going to be under more pressure than those selling or exporting food soybeans, meat, and so on, because people should continue to eat. And if China rebalance from investment to consumption, that could create a positive impact on those economies who are exporting soybeans, meat, etc. Also, emerging markets will face more tightening financial conditions. You see here what happened after the May announcement of Bernanke's regarding future tapering that finally started this year. You saw that the U.S. yield in bonds for 10 years increased substantially. Of course, that means that all the interest rate for everyone increased also in the international markets. On top of that, emerging markets saw, you see there, the sovereign spread also increased since the announcement. So there are two costs for the emerging market at this moment. One's given by the baseline, that is the T-bond, the 10 years T-bond, and the other given that the spread is now higher for countries in Latin America. And this creates also some capital outflows. You can see there that since May's announcement, a lot of capital outflows happen in Latin America. You can see the end of the graph on the left, and also creates some pressure on the domestic currencies. Both announcements, I have to say, the announcement in May, when Bernanke for the first time talked about the tapering in the future, and also the implementation of the final implementation that was December 18. In all countries across the region, you saw some pressures on the domestic currencies. Now, all this will have an impact in Latin America. Here I will present briefly some exercise, because these are changing external conditions, and changing external conditions will have a real impact in Latin American economies. You can see here some effects. I mean, basically it's saying that an increase in the US growth rate, because if the Fed is tapering, it's because the US is growing faster, will have a positive effect in Latin American economies. But then an increase in real interest rate, or a decrease in the commodity prices, or even an increase in the degree of risk aversion, as we economists call, will have a negative effect in the LAC economies. However, you see here a summary of this exercise. You see there what are the hypotheses behind this exercise. Interest growing, the US growing from 1%, going from the growth of 1% to around 3%, increases in real interest rate, decreases of 10% in commodity prices, and an increase in risk aversion in the market. I put all together in the same exercise to see what is going to be the final result for Latin American economies. And as we expect, or as we said in Paraguay, this is not a negative event. This could create some volatility in the short term, in the transition, but at the end you will see that the positive factor is much important than the negative one. So at the end you will have a positive impact on growth rate in Latin America. And that should be the case, because it's the largest economy who is recovering. Now, in the transition, it's going to be key, as Julio mentioned, to have some fundamental, to have some policies, because what we learned since May announcements is that fundamentals matter. And what I mean by that, those countries that suffered the most, and suffer, I mean, had larger increases in the interest rate they're paying for their bonds, or they suffer larger domestic currency depreciation, were those countries, for example, having higher inflation rate or higher current account deficit. So those countries who had a disequilibrium at the macro level suffered the most. So this is a lesson for the future. We need to prepare ourselves for the future, for the new global economy, by implementing sound macroeconomic policy. And what happened in Latin America? In Latin America, you can see there that was one of the countries who recovered faster from the 2008 global crisis, and that is thanks to strong fundamentals. It's a new Latin America. You can see there all the different variables, macroeconomic variables, how the variables were improving over time. That allowed the countries to create some buffers so they could implement counter-cyclical policies after the global crisis. Now, what has been the problem? The problem is that at the margin and after the global crisis, some vulnerabilities has increased in the region, especially in some countries. By that I mean especially some current account deficits and some deterioration on the fiscal space or the fiscal result of some countries. Why? Because they implemented these counter-cyclical policies. They had space to do that, but now, like 6 years after, they needed to reverse those policies, but not all the countries were rebuilding the cushions, the buffers, in order to face future volatility, so they keep doing the same, and that put the public finance and the external accounts under pressure. And that had created, at least for some countries, a rising in the likelihood of a sudden stop episode. What is that? Just a sudden outflow of capitals. As I showed before, I showed a graph with all the capital outflows from Latin America, but this is slow movement. What now happened is that with the current deterioration in the current account, in the fiscal stance of some countries, those countries had increased the likelihood of a sudden outflow that will put a lot of pressure on the economies in Latin America. That is something that deserves attention. We are in better position in Latin America than during the 90s, but we're in a worse position than before the global crisis to face a new shock. Now let me talk a little bit about what are we doing in Paraguay in order to face the new global economy. Let me say something I said last week in Brazil during the IDV annual meetings. It used to be the case that with the Paraguayan authorities, only 2 companies wanted to talk during the IMF or World Bank meetings. Those 2 companies were 2 companies that the country defaulted on them. So they wanted the bill to be paid, and those were the only one wanted to talk to Paraguay. But right now, as I said, JP Morgan was organizing an event exclusively about Paraguay at the IDV meeting. That means a lot of change for a country, small, tiny country who is making a lot of noise at this moment. And let me go ahead and explain why it's making a lot of noise at this moment, because it's a good reason why it's making the noises now. In the past decade, we have seen big changes in policy frameworks and also on the structural reforms. So that is putting the country in a good position to weather these more challenging times. And let me give you some numbers. I call always the old Paraguay and the new Paraguay. The old Paraguay was a country growing at most at 1.9%. Until 2003. 2003, we have an IMF program, standby agreement. So since then, the basis of the economy what was put in place. And since then, you can see an economy that is growing at 4.8% per year on average. Last year was a record high, 14%, 1.4 economic growth for Paraguay. The growth rate is among the highest in the region. Of course, Peru here from Julio is growing faster, but Paraguay is now growing much faster than, for example, some neighbors like Brazil. Now, but we are growing in an ordered manner. We really believe that low inflation is very important. This is a very important signal in a region that is very well known for hyperinflation. And we have implemented since 2011 an IT regime, making explicit our target of 5% inflation rate per year. Now, the economy over time has built large buffer in order to dampen excessive volatility. This is the amount of reserve that we have at the central bank. And you can see there that is almost 20% of GDP, the amount that we have at this moment. This is a lot of cautions in order to face the future volatility given the adjustment at the Fed policy. Now, it's not only the central bank who was doing a good job, but also the Minister of Finance, because we went from being a country with selected default according to the credit rating agencies to a country that, if you compare with the same peers meaning the same degree of credit rating, that the same degree of sovereign rating that the Standard & Poor's and Moody gives the country, we are the one with the lowest external debt, that is less than 10% of GDP. So compounded with 20% of international reserve, you can see that now, instead of being a net debtor to vis-a-vis the war, we are now in a position where net creditors vis-a-vis the war. And this is very nice. You can see this is the government talking about this, but this is what Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch is saying about the country. You can see, even though we have a lot of volatility in emerging markets, like a month ago, we received an upgrade. We're only 2 notches below investment grade. This is a big accomplishment, especially because 10 years before we were rated as selected default country. Right now we're 2 notches to investment grade. Now, the normalization of monetary conditions in the US is not necessarily a negative event. This is the largest economy in the world recovering, so the effect in the different countries will depend on robustness of economic policies. In LAC, as I showed before, fundamentals have improved over the past decade, and most economies are right now well prepared to face the headwinds, as we call. Of course, growth will be less than before because we have a different external environment, but in case that there is some deceleration in the economies, policies will depend on the particular situation of the country. For those countries who has low inflation, they have controlled inflation expectation, monetary policy will be able to act and should be the first line of defense, meaning deceleration could mean lower interest rate in order to boost economic growth. Also, fiscal policy could also serve as a second row of defense. But the problem here is, as I mentioned before, several countries did not rebuild their buffers on the fiscal space. So those countries will need to continue tightening and to continue to rebuild those cushions in order to have some room of maneuver in the future on the fiscal side. To end, history teaches that exits from an extremely low interest rate in the US may be smooth or bumpy, and that will depend on expectations, fundamentals, and countries' capacity to respond. Since monetary normalization is unavoidable, is a chronicle foretold, authorities should take the opportunity to implement policies at this moment in order to minimize any negative event in the future. In this way, we believe that country will gain more from the global recovery. That is something that is positive in the long run. Thank you very much.